So without further delay, Mr. John Smith, where are you? I'd like to introduce John. He'll be giving us insight into the beginnings, context, as it were.
Thank you, Bella. So yes, John Smith really is my name. So it's an honor to be here, and quite honestly, standing up here, looking out at all of you, I also recognize the gravity of what's here. So who am I, and why am I talking to you? As the sign says, I am a former 7th District State Senator. I served for 11 months, but they tell me that just because I served, I can keep the title. But really, the reason why I'm speaking tonight is because I grew up in white supremacy. For real. Not just being told that I was a racist, but really living in white supremacy. As a child growing up in our household, we had the major players of white supremacy coming through our house. We had the Richard Butlers of the Aryan Nations. We had various members of the order. We had a lot of the top players. After I left home, my grandparents' house was the first place that Randy Weaver came after he left the courthouse. So that tells you the kind of circles that my grandparents traveled in. So when I was a teenager, I made the choice that wasn't the lifestyle for me, that wasn't the belief system that I wanted to build my life on, and I picked up and left. Well, what you will hear from a lot of people is that, they will talk as if white supremacy or anti-Semitism is like gluten, that just one day you can decide to give it up. But that's not the case. The way that philosophy, that point of view works, is it's fundamental to who you are inside. And so while I made the choice as a teenager to walk away from it, I will be the first to admit that I have spent the majority of my adult life trying to overcome it, trying to wash that off. And if today, if you were to ask me, are you a racist? The honest answer that I can give you is I don't want to be. But is there something inside of me? Is there a remnant of the way I was raised? Is there some sort of archaic part of who I used to be that's still there? Maybe. And thankfully, there are trusted friends in this room that help me look inside, listen to me, reflect back to me who I am today, and help me ferret that out. So I want to tell you a brief story, and then I want to kind of move through the slides fairly quickly. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, in my grandparents' house, I came down to make a sandwich, as teenagers are apt to do at various times of the day. And sitting around my grandparents' kitchen table were a group of my grandfather's friends who were Christian identity, hardcore, for real racists. And they were sitting around discussing a plan in which they would take over the Northwest states, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Wyoming, that they would make their own country, and when they did that, boy, would things be different. For one thing, they'd be hanging all of those dirty Jews from light poles. And right beside those dirty Jews would be all of those Mexicans and all of those blacks that dare look at a white woman. And right beside all of them would be those Judeo-Christian pastors who dared to let our nation slip into the state where it had lasted. And so I was a young Christian at that point. I like to say that Jesus came and found me, because I don't think that I was really looking. But he actually found me, and this wasn't the first time I heard that kind of rhetoric, but when I heard it, something stirred inside of me. Could have been teenage rebellion, or it could have been righteous indignation, or it could have been some random combination of either. But I engaged them, and I started arguing with them, and by the time that conversation was over, I knew I needed to leave. So what drives people to talk like that? What drives them to think like that? Why would your average, ordinary Christian all of a sudden start adopting that kind of violent rhetoric? Well, some of it revolves around this particular verse, Genesis 1:26, King James. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." This is what, to many in the Christian identity world, which was the religion my grandfather was a part of, this verse is what they call the dominion mandate. This is what they say gives them authority over everyone and everything. They believe that because as white people they are made in the image of God, that therefore they automatically have the right to rule over anyone and everyone else. But I want to point out that if we read through this list, because this is the Bible, if we read through this list, let's read through that list one more time. Let's figure out what's on that list. What did man actually get dominion over? Dominion over the fish of the sea, fowl of the air, cattle, over all the earth, and by the way, that earth word is dirt, over all the dirt, over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So there's creeping creepers, there's fish, there's fowls, there's cattle, there's dirt. Where are the other men? There aren't any men. There aren't any women. The dominion mandate doesn't mean that one group of people gets to rule over another. The dominion mandate means that we have a responsibility to care for and steward the earth. That is a stark difference from a mandate to tell everybody else what they get to do and to mandate our own will over other people. But this dominion mandate is the fundamental principle of what is called dominionism, or what fuels a white supremacist, a neo-Nazi, a Christian identity follower to believe that they have the right to control your choices. It's literally the opposite of what we were created to do. So that brings us to today. What does dominionism look like? Dominionism looks like a place where the dominionist is the hero and everyone else is the villain. Dominionism looks like a place where there are only a few select righteous people, and they must, absolutely must, exert their will over everyone else, or the kingdom of God can never take place on earth. Boom! I don't believe that. So, the thing about dominionism is that to a dominionist, there can be only one. Competition is a bad thing in dominionism. So it's not just the dominionists or the Christian identity folks or the white supremacists. It's not just that they like darker-skinned people, because where I grew up in Christian identity, Catholics were Satanists. Mormons were witches. Jews were God's enemies, and we'll get to some more on that in a minute. Muslims, all of them are terrorists just because they're Muslims. Methodists are fundamentally immoral. Charismatics are just crazy. Atheists are scary. Everyone who can't agree with them is unteachable. And let's not forget that reporters are dirty, hateful, and godless. So for a dominionist, either you agree with them or you're the bad guy. You're the enemy. Now, there's kind of a narrative that you'll hear from time to time, and you'll hear people who come from a dominionist background, who come from a Christian identity background, who come from a white supremacist background, and what they will tell you is, I can't be a racist. I've got a black friend. Look, this is my black friend. How can I be a racist and have a black friend? So this is the part that we were taught in Christian identity. We need to seek out allies from other races so that when people accuse us of racism, we can say, I'm not a racist. I've got a black friend, or I've got a Mexican friend, or I used to know a guy who was from Asia. I don't know what part of Asia, but some part of Asia. In Christian identity, we were taught to seek out people who were involved in politics, get our picture taken with office holders. We were taught to seek out community leaders, your leader of Chamber of Commerce, your local newspaper reporters, and not to tell them everything about what we believe, because frankly, that's a little offensive and shocking. We were taught to lay it on pretty thick and to explain to them why everything that we believe was pretty innocuous. We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to do bad things. Because after all, as long as you agree with us, we like you in Christian identity. So to a Christian identity dominionist, everyone is welcome. And this is the part that people on the outside of this don't get. As long as you agree, you're welcome in a white supremacist Christian identity circle. If you look at the order had a member from Southeast Asia who certainly was not white. The order had a Hispanic American. The order actively sought out black people to join them. That's a part of what they do. That's a part of how they work. Because as long as you bend the knee and accept their headship over you, you're good. You're acceptable. You belong. Now, if you're darker skinned, you can never belong as much as a lighter skinned person, but you'll most certainly belong more than a darker skinned person who doesn't submit. So you receive some measure of validation. Until you don't submit. And then if we look back at the biblical basis of war and what was said in it, as long as they're willing to submit to you, as long as they're willing to receive your dominion, as long as they're willing to accept your authority, they're all good. They can just be taxed. But wait and see what happens when anyone, red, yellow, black, and white, stands up to a dominionist and says no. Scorched earth. There is nothing off the table when you say no to a dominionist. So this is threats we face, and we're supposed to be looking at the modern threat and how this works in today's world. So on the right-hand side is Radio Free Northwest from the Northwest Front website. The Northwest Front is the new version, the 2019 version of the Aryan Nation. The Northwest Front is a political organization of Aryan men and women who recognize that an independent and sovereign white nation in the Pacific Northwest is the only possibility for the survival of the white race on this continent. That was just from last night. If you search through that website and then compare it to many of the things that are said on the website beside it, radiofreereadout.com, they're talking about the same region, they're talking about the same problems, and they're offering the same solutions. Now, am I saying that everybody on this screen on the left is identical to people on the right? I'm not saying everybody is, but I'm saying that there are some very scary similarities between the white supremacist, neo-Nazi, dominionist world that I grew up in, and what is called the Redoubt moving today. There are striking similarities, and I invite you, you can see the URLs there on the screen, look it up for yourself. Some of those striking similarities can be found here. So if you scroll through the Northwest Front, when my grandfather and his friends were talking about their whites-only nation, and they were talking about setting up their little world where they were in control, they didn't dream that idea up all by themselves. Christian identity leaders were cultivating this idea. And what they would say is, how do we take our country back? How do we take power away from the Jews who control everything, from all of those other races who are corrupting everything, how do we get the power away from them and restore ourselves, restore our dominion over everything? So the guy there on the left is Richard Butler, and Richard Butler wrote out an outline of what that needed to look like, how that needed to work, what they would need to do to walk through that, and that's what my grandfather and his friends were talking about. Now, Richard Butler had a friend, and they were actually friends, named Brigadier General Jack Moore. Jack Moore and Richard Butler both served as security for one of the Christian Identity founders' names, who's Wesley Swift. So while Butler had this plan, which you can read in detail for yourself on the Northwest Front website, Jack Moore also had his own plan, which was not the same, not identical, not word for word, but similar. And Jack Moore got around a little bit. Jack Moore, here, you can see, met with a group of folks, other Christian identity leaders. And you can see up there on the top is the picture and the list of the different names. And they came together and talked about how do we implement this plan for taking our nation back, for exerting our dominion over America. How do we do that? So they got together and they developed the Remnant Resolves. And here the first quote says, "It was agreed at the outset that if all the men on the committee did not agree with the final draft, the entire project would be abandoned and the disagreement would be accepted as an indication that the project was not of God." So all of those folks, including Barry Bird of Marble Community Fellowship, all agreed on the next statements that were made. First of all, resolved. And these are only two because it's a bigger booklet. But these two I think are relevant for the current discussion. He is Antichrist that denieth the Father and the Son. It is blasphemous to regard Antichrist as God's chosen people and to allow them to rule over or hold public office in a Christian nation. Antichrist is a code word in Christian identity for Jews. So when you hear folks from a Christian identity background talk about Antichrist, they're not just talking about non-Christians, they are specifically talking about the Jews who they believe rule everything.
That is a blatant lie.
Then below that, it further says resolve. Aborticide is murder. Sodomy is a sin against God and nature. And here's a gem. Interracial marriage pollutes the integrity of the family. Now these aren't my words. I didn't make this up. I didn't define this. This is lifted out of their document that they published in the late 80s. So, there are some people on that list that would tell you that, oh yeah, well that was back in the 80s. Back in the 80s we believed that, but we don't believe that anymore. It's like gluten. We gave it up. That's not our thing anymore. But this is 10 years later, where we're looking at these things, an understanding of the race issue by Pastor Pete Peters. Does that cover make you think that Pete Peters was thinking very highly of people with darker skin? Open up the book and leaf through it, and it gets even more derogatory than the cover. In the mid-90s also, there was a person that was interested in becoming a member of Marble Community Fellowship, and they wrote this. These aren't my words, these are their words. Late in the summer of 1994, at that point we were considering becoming a part of the community. But at some point in that discussion, Barry Bird stated that he did not believe in interracial marriage, and that our non-white children would not be allowed to marry any of the sons and daughters of Marble, and that we would have to have faith that God would provide them with mates of their own race. I stated that I was unaware of any scripture that forbade interracial marriage, and then Barry said that although he agreed that there was no specific scripture, he believed that God had a place for the nations and the races. And then down a little bit further below, we see that Reverend John Weaver offered a sermon in which he concluded that people of color lack souls and would only enter the kingdom of God as subordinates to whites. That was right along with Aryan Nations folks, with Ku Klux Klan folks, and etc. Again, guys, I didn't make this up. This is their stuff. Now, if you don't believe what was said on the previous one, we can fast forward to today. In 2015, Marble Community Fellowship invited Pastor John Weaver to be their patriot pastor, their position of honor as an example of this is what we want to see in Christian leadership. And here is one of the sermons that he posted right after he came up here to join with them. Who were the enemies of Christ, he asked, and who were the enemies of the disciples? In 2015, he published a 5-part series in which he ultimately answered those questions and decided that, yes, the Jews were the problem, and yes, the Jews were the enemies of Christ and the disciples. Then further, he gives a 14-part series in which he talks about the pre-Civil War South as being the ideal version of America. That slavery really wasn't that bad, and it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, there weren't that people that were negatively impacted, and honestly, according to him, the blacks had it pretty good as slaves. And the abolition movement was where the real antichrists were, because the people who wanted to do away with slavery, you know, those Methodists, they were fundamentally immoral and pretty rotten people. They were the ones that were trying to destroy the country. So if you don't want to believe this, you are welcome to go and look up John Weaver's sermons by himself, and make sure to take note of that. Jews, Judaism, and Christianity, Part 1 from September of 2015. If you have the stomach, you can listen to that for yourself and hear what he has to say. So it sounds like I just want to find white supremacists all over the place and start talking about how bad they are. And so one thing that some folks will say is, well, you're a hypocrite, because you were one of those too. And here's the deal. I was. And if you'll remember how I started this, I'll even go so far as to say I still might have some of that. But Leviticus 5:1 tells me that if I am a witness to wrongdoing and I don't speak up about it, that I share in the guilt of it. And so as a Christian, as a conservative, as a Republican, when I see Christian conservative Republicans, or people who say they are Christian conservative Republicans, promoting ideals that are absolutely contrary to Christianity, to the Republican values that I believe in, and to the America that I love, if I don't speak up, then I wear it. So, if we look at Dylan Roof, he wasn't too long ago. Actually, he was just a couple of months when Dylan Roof walked into a black church, listened to them pray, and pulled out a handgun and shot them dead while they ran for cover and prayed for him while he was shooting. While that happened, 2 months later, Marble Community Fellowship thought that he'd be a great keynote speaker to come and talk about the beauties of America in front of a Confederate battle flag and tell people that slavery was really okay. It wasn't really a big deal. This is what Dylan Roof said. This is what he said motivated him. He said that he looked at history, and if you go through his whole manifesto, he goes into a lot of detail about the South. And it sounds to me like the bullet points that he ticks off, it sounds to me like he's listened to or heard or read or rubbed shoulders with John Weaver. The South had a higher ratio of blacks than when we were holding them as slaves. And because of, he explains in the manifesto, the way that blacks fundamentally were destroying the moral fiber of the South, he had no choice. Things were getting so bad. He had tried to talk to people. He had tried to reason to people. But there just was no choice left to him until he said at the beginning, well, someone has to have the bravery to take it to the real world, and I guess that has to be me. Where would somebody think that they needed to use violence to enforce their version of morality on other people? Well, if we go back to that quote in The Remnant Resolves, right after it talks about interracial marriage polluting the integrity of the family, it says, God forgive us of our iniquities in this matter, and cleanse us by thy swift judgment, and in thy wrath remember mercy. Now, I'm not going to try to get into the heads of each one of those Christian identity leaders, but I can tell you that when you combine the bottom statement with the philosophy that Dylan Roof had embraced from the Neo-Confederacy movement, he believed he had no choice but to start shooting black people to make a statement. Here's a list of other folks who are also connected to the Christian identity movement, many of them from this very area, who found themselves in exactly the same position as Dylan Roof. They felt like they had no other choice, like they had exhausted all the peaceful options, and now their only choice was that they had to use violence to save their country. Robert Matthews, Timothy McVeigh, Kevin Hart, the Spokane, one of the little King Day bombers, Terry Kehoe, Shane Kehoe, Danny Lee, on death row right now, going to be the Trump administration is going to release them to finally receive capital punishment. Larry Steve McWilliams, Robert Bowers, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter, and Dylan Roof. Every one of them had been driven by an extreme theology, a dominionist mindset, into thinking that they had no choice but to use violence and terrorism in order to save their country from the decadence that was being brought about by the Jews and all those brown races. So, hate can't cast out hate. We don't fix this problem by flipping the narrative around and by talking about all of these people that embrace this ideology and talking about them as if they're inhuman and how we should go out and round them up. That's not the way that works. Martin Luther King recognized that the way that we overcome hatred and bigotry is by seeing other people, by connecting with other people, by communicating with other people. Hate can't cast out hate. Only love can do that. But real love, genuine, Christ-centered love, confronts self-destructive behavior. And I am here to tell you that if you embrace dominionism, white supremacy, or Christian identity, that theology, that ideology is more destructive to you, more dangerous to your family, than to anybody else, including the folks in this room with darker skin. Because you can't embrace hate without having it rot you from the inside out. Now here's the thing. I know some of you folks are from the left. Do you want to combat white supremacy? Do you want to take a stand against prejudice and bigotry? Then quit calling every Republican a racist. Because when you do that, you make them sympathetic to the real racists. When you lump everybody all into that same category, they start to feel like, well, hey, I'm not like that, and if I'm not like that, well, then maybe they're not like that. So, folks on the left, the most powerful thing that you can do to end and to put a stumbling block in front of Christian identity and dominionism is quit painting every Republican with a racist brush. It doesn't fit, it's wrong, and you're contributing to the problem. Generalization leads to prejudice. It's just like when a white supremacist tries to make every black person accountable for the actions of a single black person. When you try, on the left, when you try to make every white person responsible for the actions of one or a few white people, that generalization erodes your argument. Justice requires dealing in specifics, not in generality. Dominionism and Christian identity aren't really Christianity. They're more cultish than anything else. And finally, if you see something that isn't right, if you see activity, if you see behavior, if you see people that are leaning in this direction, I'm not saying you have to get up in front of an audience and do what I'm doing, because frankly, this might be a little stupid. If you see something, if you're at work and somebody tells the off-color joke or talks about that rotten Mexican or what have you, just say, guys, that's not cool. That's not good. Don't do that. And leave it at that. And then finally, if you really want to get to the bottom of this, if you really want to undo this, let's talk to each other. Somebody in the room's already said that I'm a liar. Somebody's already said that I've made all of this up. I get accused of being a liar a lot by folks who like Representative Shea and who like his philosophy and etc. So here I am. I'll be around. You can connect with me on Facebook. Let's talk. Let's get coffee. Let's talk face to face. And you know what? Because I'm a Christian, there is evidence that I admitted I was wrong once. And if I was wrong once, there's a good chance I'm still wrong about a lot of things. And if I am, you might actually convince me to say I'm sorry, which is possible. So, with that said, this is my background, this is my history, but this is only a part of the story. So I'd like now to introduce a man who I've come to regard as a friend, Jay Pember.